What's going on, guys? This is going to be our 1 year anniversary for the summary of markets, which is week 52. We're going to get into SPY, gold, oil, Bitcoin, and Ethereum. I'm actually going to add silver to this summary of markets as well upon request. So let's start off with SPY. SPY tried to push higher this week, or last week, I should say, but it was not able to really find any buyers above 383. You had a couple days where you were trying to push up, but then if you look at the lower time frame price action, you just were not able to really find any buyers above that 383. Every time it pushed up, it either distributed or failed downward. It had a gap down there, big sell off, tried to push up, and then you saw a gap down again. So lots of sellers around this kind of 384, 385 range leading us downward. We put in a big gap here that it tried to fill on this pullback here, but there's just too much resistance. You had the 382, the 383, you had the 50 moving average, you had a pivot there, you had the range low. There's just a massive amount of resistance being put in around that 383 now because we were not able to gain that. So you tried to fill the gap, wasn't successful. Sellers stepped in very heavily, started to sell off towards the end of the day on, I believe that was Thursday. And then Friday we saw a gap down and then it failed even lower. So massive resistance moving forward all the way from like 375 to 385 is a lot of resistance. We do have a couple of gaps that we could fill on the way up. Let's go ahead and delete this. We're going to mark out our gap fills moving forward. So we have a gap fill right here around 377.50, and then we have one right here around 383. Could say 384 on that one. So these will be your clear targets if you're buying dips. But what I will say is this is the first day that we have lost the 50 moving average on the daily on SPY since back in November. So this is a pretty key day. If we look at ES as well, we're basically bouncing right off that 50. But it already bounced on the previous two candles, and then we failed it on this candle. So if we don't immediately see buy pressure on Monday or Tuesday, I would say by Wednesday, you are going to see a very strong sell-off down probably at least 2.5%, maybe 3%, if we cannot reclaim this 50 with strong buyers. So keep that in mind. Now, obviously, if I threw on, let me go back to this chart here, it'll be easier. If we take a look at the monthly VWAP close that we had back in December, we're bouncing off that almost to the tick. So if I go to SPY here, we basically bottomed on that monthly VWAP perfectly. Now, if you look at ES, basically the same thing. So as long as this monthly VWAP holds, you are still slightly bullish. But every single time, you can backtest this for years, almost every single time that SPY or ES loses its previous month's VWAP, it sees a significant sell-off. And by significant, I mean for the short term, obviously on the daily time frame, so anywhere from 5 to 10%. But just keep that in mind. So if we lose this monthly VWAP, I would say easily you could go down to 3,600. If it really wanted to continue lower, you could go down to the previous month's VWAP around 3,500, which would be about a 4% correction. Now, I'm not calling for massive bearish momentum just yet, but just know that, like I said, if you don't find any buyers very early on Monday or Tuesday, I think you're going to see a pretty strong sell-off. So just keep that in mind. Now, if you do find buyers, as I said, these two gap fills above you are your obvious targets. All right, moving on to gold. Gold basically did exactly what we said. You're continuing the downtrend. You saw that sell pressure coming in when we made the last video. You basically sold off every single day. You tried to pump up on Friday, probably mainly from the silver pump. Silver is getting a pretty strong pump, which we're going to talk about here in a second, which is probably going to help the other commodities like gold. But for now, gold is still in a massive downtrend. I would like to see gold at least turn green on the OTS, flip the 50 moving average, flip the OTS trail, and then it would start to look bullish into like 1923, 1950. But realistically, if we're talking about on like a long-term standpoint, gold is not bullish until you reclaim this pivot, because you can see that all of this has just been failed accumulation. Accumulation, failed. Accumulation, failed. Basically all the way through. So this entire area is just a bunch of failed buyers. So I would not be extremely bullish on gold until you reclaimed that pivot, which would break most of the accumulation that was failing. Okay, so keep that in mind. So above 1950, I would keep an eye on 2000 and then around 2030. Now, before we go to oil, let me actually talk about silver here. Make sure I'm using the proper futures. Let's see, which one is the silver future? It's S1. Here we go. So I'll use this chart to go over silver. So silver, you've been a lot more bullish than gold recently. You had this massive impulse up. You tried to put in a bullish pennant and continue higher, and it just couldn't do it. You saw that massive failure downward, bounced off the pivot, bounced off the pivot, bounced off the pivot. So what are we seeing on silver? We're seeing a massive supply, massive support around that 2280, 2350, all the way up to 24, basically. Buyers are stepping in down here, and they are holding silver higher, right? So when silver went on this little short-term run here, and you had this nasty sell-off, it retested that value, okay? So you have like this massive accumulation range right here, and then you have this bullish pennant. These are the two most important patterns to look at right here, because this is your failed impulse, where you had that bullish impulse up, it failed downward, and it gave them another chance to reaccumulate, okay? So they're reaccumulating here, and then they went for their second breakout attempt. This also failed, but look at what we're seeing. This pullback here is pulling back to retest this value. So this is actually extremely bullish. So as long as this value, the buyers basically confirm that they approve of 26, anything higher than 26 is getting bought up, and then anything that dips below 26 is also being bought up. They are confirming that they like this value. So this is extremely bullish. Anything above 26 should continue higher. You'll be looking at around $29.90 to $30 as your local target. Now, if we are moving on further, if we look at the weekly, you do have a little pivot there around 28.50. There's not really many pivots above you. You have that pivot there, and then this entire price action here, there is no weekly pivot. So if we go to the monthly, we have one more pivot right above us around 31. So understand that 31, basically 28 to 31 is massive resistance. But once we clear this, there really isn't much above us. So keep an eye on that. If you do see a strong breakout with good volume on these two pivots here, above 32, there's really not much left, and you could really impulse all the way up into 40, 45. Now, obviously, that's a long-term analysis. We're going to go back over this probably next week as well, but just keep that in mind. Short-term bullish, silver is very bullish. Let's move on to oil here. So oil, I told you guys last week, if you could not reclaim that pivot, you were most likely going to come back down and break the trail, head back down to 48. You are slowly doing that. So you're not reclaiming the pivot. You are pushing lower here, but this is slightly bullish, I would say, because you are above the OTS trail, and you are also getting OPEC supply cuts, okay? So the OPEC has agreed to cut the supply of oil, and they said they have a 99% agreement on their new supply cuts. So that should increase the price of oil. If demand stays the same, supply goes down, that does increase the price, okay? So if oil does start to break this pivot around 53.50, 54, then you should easily continue higher into the 59 and 60.50 range, okay? So keep an eye on that. Moving on to Bitcoin, basically exactly what I told you guys last week played out. I told you that you could look for a short-term bounce there, but any bounce should not be very bullish, and you should not get very bullish until you start to reclaim like 38 to 40,000, because that is most likely a bull trap, and that's exactly what happened here. You tried to push higher, it created a massive bull trap, and now you're actually getting sell signals on the OTS because you're not able to reclaim that trail. So as long as you stay below like 35 to 37, this is major resistance here. You are putting in kind of a short-term bulldog where you put in that double bottom, kind of pop up and put in a pullback back to value. So I would say like very short-term, like 1 hour, you are slightly bullish, but this is a nasty sell-off here. This is a massive trap, just as we predicted. So I think there are a lot of sellers that are pushing this lower, and there are a lot of buyers that are trying to get out of their positions. So be careful on that. You could start to get a little bullish if you do break 37,000, but still, I would really like to see a break of 39,000 because you are putting in lower highs. Okay, so once you break that lower high structure, putting in a new high above 39,000, then you could start to be slightly bullish. Now, on the other hand, if you do actually start to fail downward here, you are being protected by the 50 moving average here, as you can see. That's probably not going to hold for much longer, but if it does pull back, anywhere from 28 to 25,000 is a lot of support. You're going to be retesting kind of that secondary breakout point. So keep an eye on that. If you do start to accumulate down here, you could push back higher into the 35,000 range. Moving on to Ethereum. Ethereum is slightly different because you are still maintaining your bullish structure. You are kind of putting in that rising wedge like we talked about in last week's video. But as I said, rising wedges in crypto just have not been playing out very well. They've actually been breaking to the upside more than they have the downside. And that's especially true when you have a bull market. If there's a massive bull market, rising wedges typically don't matter and you still break out higher. So I would not pay attention to the rising wedge here. What I would pay attention to is how you are finding a lot of sell pressure above this kind of 1400 range. You've tried to break 1400 3 times here, maybe even 4 if you consider that, and you've sold off every single time. Now, you are putting in higher lows. If you go down to a lower time frame, you can see here that you are maintaining a slightly bullish market structure here, which looks like you might be breaking very soon. So I would keep a very close eye on this low here. If you keep putting in those higher lows, you most likely will break that high and continue into like 15 to 1600 because that is slightly bullish. You do have an ascending triangle, but the momentum is definitely flipping to the bearish side. So if this short-term momentum on the Momo continues to go negative, and you finally break that zero line, you start to see that trail start to pull back, you most likely will pull back towards like 1200 or maybe even like 1075. So keep an eye on that. Right now, I would either be not taking any trades or I would be very, very slightly bullish because of that higher low structure. As soon as you break that higher low structure, I would definitely be looking to get out of my bullish positions. All right, that's the summary markets. Let's move on to the options watch list. Now, for this week, there really isn't many charts that I like. There's not a lot of charts that look very good for trades. But I'm going to go through the ones that have been on my watch list for some time now. I'm still watching Peloton. If you do start to find some buyers around like 135, 136, this could look to continue higher. This is a pattern that we've been trading for the past couple of weeks, where we have that breakout and we kind of have that distribution above the previous high. This is typically pretty bullish as long as you can hold on to that previous high. So if it starts to find some support here, you could look to push higher into that 163 area. PLTR, I'm not really watching for a trade right now. You already hit most of our targets. As I told you guys, 2650 was holding us down. Once you broke 2650, once you broke that 2850 pivot, you were very likely going to go into all-time highs, which is what you did. You hit our 2 targets here and you hit our 2 targets here. So you only have one final target remaining around 4770, and I would not really look for that target until you start to find value above 43. Now, if you do pull back to the initial breakout point, kind of around 31 to 33, if you find support down here, you could look to retest these targets again. So keep an eye on that. AMD, I don't really like. You had bad earnings reaction, sold off. You saw the continuation. You broke the distribution bearishly. It looks like AMD wants to come back down to this support around 8250 or 83. If you start to find support around here, which you have a lot of support, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 months of VWAP, and you have that pivot. So tons of support down here. If you start to pull back and you hold above, like I'd say 80, you could very easily pull back and retest that 90 range. So keep an eye on that support below you. Chegg, I'm not really looking for a trade on this anymore, but I do like this support being found. Keep an eye on that buy signal. If you do get confirmed like Monday or Tuesday and you start holding above that gap around 97.50, you could easily hit 100 and 103. Okay, so keep an eye on that. TDOC, you broke out just as we predicted. You hit most of our targets. The only target you did not hit was our final target around 301. Same thing here, like we were talking about on PLTR. You could pull back to the initial breakout point, but if this does start to push higher, you find some buyers above 280, 160, you could very easily get that final target around 381. Or excuse me, 301. SBUX, you're failing a distribution bearishly. It is pulling back to retest that previous month's VWAP. You also have a gap below you down to like 90. So keep an eye on these two supports. You have a support around 94.50 and a support around 90, let's say 90.50. If these two supports hold, you could easily push higher back into that distribution. Look for that gap fill right around 103. Square tried to push back up when Bitcoin was seeing a lot of buyers, but as soon as Bitcoin started to sell off again, so did Square. This is also an extremely bearish retest. You had that kind of little bit of a distribution that we were putting in up here, and then you failed downward, put in that morning star, tried to confirm it, and then you instantly rejected that level around 225. So as long as you stay below 225, this is very likely going to go down and retest that kind of doji there around 204. If you break 204, very likely going down to like 188. Moving on to AI, I told you guys if it broke 139, very likely going to see 160. That's exactly where it topped out, and now we're pulling back to retest that 139 support. If you do stay above 139 here, you are putting in a bulldog, so you have that double bottom popped up, and now you're pulling back to retest that value. If you do start to push back above like 142, 145, very easily could retest that 160. If you start to reclaim 160, very likely going into all-time high around 184. Nordstrom, the trade has basically played out on Nordstrom. You are putting in a daily buy signal, so if you do see confirmation on this buy signal by Monday, you could be very bullish, but you do have a lot of resistance above you, so even if you do push higher on that buy signal, it could be a trap, and it would turn into like a head and shoulders. So I don't really like Nordstrom until you start to find value above 39. Find value above 39, very likely going into 45. Moving on to Target, similar chart to Peloton, where we had that initial high breakout, and now we're pulling back to retest that initial high. As long as you stay above like 181, you could push higher back into that pivot around 191. Okay, so keep an eye on the support here. You do have a little bit of support below you if you do fail around 177 and 173, but losing that previous high would be very bearish, so be careful on that. Ulta, I'm not really watching anymore. Let's go ahead and take that off our list. Disney, it's getting pretty choppy price action here, but obviously the only thing you really need to watch is this downtrend. If you break this downtrend to the upside, you get above that pivot around 174, you could start to look very bullish into like 179, 181. But this downtrend does not look very good, especially into earnings. So if you continue downward into earnings, earnings would be the only thing that would save you from this complete gap fill here. So keep an eye on that. You could just slow bleed into the gap fill right into earnings, and then that could be a very bullish report that bounces you off that gap fill. But I probably would not take a bullish sentiment here until either you reclaim 174 or you get very good earnings. Now, Cloud has a very similar chart to the ones that we've been watching, kind of pulling back to retest the previous high. Then we saw that breakout here, which was pretty bullish. What I don't like about this is you're putting in a lower high. Okay, so you pulled back to retest your previous high. You saw that buyer step in, but then you put in a lower high. So this is typically pretty bearish. You had a couple buy signals here, but as I told you guys in Discord, if you put in a lower high and then you put in buy signals, they're a lot weaker. So these buy signals did not play out because of that lower high. So you could pull back to retest VWAP around 27, 2650 still support. You do have a gap fill that has not, you have a gap right here that has not been filled. So that is also support. But it's really hard to take a bullish position here. If you wanted to be bullish on cloud, you would have to look for support kind of around that 2650 range. MVIS, I told you guys above 671, your target was 835. You hit that target beautifully, and that became the top. So for now, that doesn't look too bullish. You could be a cup and handle. So you could be putting in that cup and then handling back down to support. But you would really have to see a strong bounce off this support. So if you start to find buyers off this support, and then you reclaim that 835, then that cup and handle could be in play, and then you could look for that breakout into like $10. Until that happened, I wouldn't be very bullish on that. Lemonade, for the most part, the trade is finished. You hit most of our targets already. I do like this buy signal, though, so I'm keeping an eye on that buy signal. If you start to break above like 157, which is Friday's high, you could look for 169, and then 179 would be that previous pivot. So keep an eye on Friday's high as your trigger. Home Depot, I was watching here for this breakout, but it had a nasty pullback. You're kind of putting in a bulldog here, but it's very choppy. What I would keep an eye on for Home Depot is if you flip green on the OTS or white, if you're using my colors, that would look pretty bullish into breaking 293 and continuing higher. This weekly chart is extremely bullish. It has a pretty nice distribution here. Very clear support being put in around 267 down to 265. So as long as that support holds, you should be pushing higher long term. Nvidia, I still do not like until you reclaim 550. So anything below 550, I'm not really interested in. If you start to break 550, this distribution has been going on for a very long time, and you should very easily break 600. Moving on to Intel, I like the gap fill on Intel, but nasty sell-off towards the end of the week last week. If you do pull back to retest this gap, if you start to put in like a double bottom or an accumulation down here, this could be an interesting trade because you had a lot of action around this level, kind of around that previous gap, and then you have that previous high structure there. So a lot of support coming in around that level. So keep an eye on that pullback. If you start to hold that, you could look for a 59 to 60 bounce. TLS, this trade is pretty much finished. If you do pull back to the initial breakout point, which you currently are, and you start to hold as support, keep an eye on like 37.38 as your bounce target. United Foods, this trade has also played out. I told you guys above that pivot, you very easily would get $30 due to the short squeeze. That short squeeze has played out, so you guys should have closed that trade by now. Moving on to PENN. PENN and DraftKings both tried to break out on, I believe it was like Friday or Thursday, and they just could not do it. They couldn't find buyers, and they both got faked out, and then they pulled back. So until PENN breaks above like 110, 111, I probably would not take this trade. You really need to find some buyers above that high. You keep getting faked out around that level. Because you're so close to earnings, I probably would just wait for earnings. Moving on to DraftKings, we actually got caught in this trap here because I told you guys I was going to look to take that breakout trade as soon as you started to find volume above 57. If we go down to like the lower time frames, we started to break with very strong volume around that 57 mark. We took that breakout trade, and obviously we got trapped. So we lost that trade. It pulled back to retest the support, and now we're just currently back into our choppy distribution. I still like this trade if I can find buyers above 57. There are massive sellers around that level for some reason, big whales holding it down. Every single time it tries to push higher in this range, you are getting sold off very heavily. But if you do finally start to break this level and find value above it, you should easily be pushing into all-time highs around 65 to 70. So keep an eye on that. CCIV, not really watching this trade anymore. Just keeping on my watch list because I know a lot of our guys in Discord are still trading this. You still have a lot of support around 21 to 20. If you start to break above 24, look for 26 and then around 28 as your final target. MasterCard, not really watching this one right now either. Let's take that off the list. Zillow, I like the pullback to VWAP on Zillow. If you can hold this VWAP, reclaim the pivot, you could have a very easy target around like 145-ish. What I don't like is you are putting in kind of a head and shoulders, even if you do pump here. So a lot of resistance. The only trade here would basically be this really tight stop loss trade where you're putting your stop loss kind of below VWAP and you're looking for that bounce. I don't like this trade too much because you have the pivot, you have the OTS trail, and then you have that high there. So a lot of resistance, and then you also have earnings coming up very soon. FSLY I still like. As long as you can hold above this 108, you could start to easily push higher, retest that 123 target that I gave you guys before, and then you have that pivot target around 128. Anything above 108 is support for now. If you lose that 105 to 108 range, you're looking very bad, and you most likely will retest the 96 area. Moving on to Enphase, I liked Enphase earlier, but you saw a nasty rejection of that bullish reversal there on Friday, kind of putting in a head and shoulders here. Very ugly. Even if it pulls back to like 195, I would not trust it because you are kind of SR flipping that support into resistance. So until you start to reclaim around 205, then I would be bullish. But until then, I would be very bearish, probably down into like 160. Neo, I like. It's a lot similar to those charts that we looked at earlier, putting in that previous high, retesting the previous high, and finding support. So as long as you stay above that previous high as support, kind of around 54, you could continue higher into like 65 or even 70. Nasty rejection there on Friday. You should have seen some more buyers step in. I don't like how low the volume is. It looks like it wants to go lower. So if you do break that 54 area, I would keep an eye on like 49 down to like 44. Very strong support around that 44 area. Airbnb hit our target, so we're not really watching this for a short-term trade. But if it does break 194, you could look for that 210 target again. So keep an eye on that. Overstock basically hit all of our targets. We were watching this little breakout pattern here. We took this trade. We got a little bit of percentage out of it, and then we got faked out when it reclaimed the resistance. I did not take this trade the second time, which was the breakout that we were looking for on the first trade. Our targets were 68, 72, and then 83. All of those targets were smashed. The only target that you could have besides that was the gap fill around 97. You just barely missed that gap fill, and now we're pulling back a little bit. So this is starting to look kind of like a giraffe where you have that double bottom pop up, and then you're pulling back to retest that support. So if you do pull back and you hold above like 73, I think this is short-term bullish. You could look for a bounce into this double pivot area around 85 and then look for that complete gap fill into 97. Invalidation would be anything below 72. Big C, very similar chart, breaking this resistance, putting in that accumulation, breaking out, retesting the breakout point. So as long as you stay above, I'd say 78, or you could even go as low as like 74. This would still be bullish, but it must maintain that VWAP. So keep an eye on that. If you didn't retest VWAP and you just maintained this 78 level, that would be fine as well. You would be targeting that 87 and that 92 area. Nectar was another short squeeze play. I told you guys it looked like it was ready to rip. I gave you a couple of upper targets. All of the upper targets were hit except for that 23.75. So the short squeeze plays are a little scary moving forward. I'd probably stay away from them for now, but that breakout was pretty clean. So keep an eye on that one. VLDR, I like this little bullish pennant that you're putting in, but you really have to bounce immediately. I don't want to see this go any lower. If you start to bounce on like Monday or Tuesday and you stay above 2250, this would look really good into 24, maybe even 27. But like I said, you really have to bounce immediately. Johnson & Johnson, I like this pullback into the daily buy signal. The only downside is this is pulling back for a reason. You had the vaccine news come out that their vaccine was only 85% effective. Now, it is a single dose, so 85% for a single dose isn't very bad compared to the 95% to the double dose, but it's still not as high as the 95% that the other vaccines were getting. So that is going down for a reason. So I'd be careful buying Johnson & Johnson here. If you did come back closer to like the 160 to 157 range, that would be a support that I would be interested in. So I'm going to keep an eye on that. Dollar General, I'm no longer watching. Nasty sell-off there. FSLR looks a lot like the charts that we talked about earlier, retesting the previous high as support. So as long as you maintain above 98 as support, if you could start to bounce here, 104 to 107 would be the easy targets. And then if you could start to find some value above this high, you could really start to push into like 120. Okay, so keep an eye on this. NLS, I actually closed this trade for a nice gain on Friday. I wanted to start taking profits on my positions going into the weekend. So we closed this for a gain of like 20% on our shares. Very beautiful trade here. Obviously, we're not all the way to our target. So if you did want to hold this into our 27 target, it doesn't look too bad. When I closed this, you were kind of wicking this. So it put in a lot of sell pressure around this kind of like 23 to 25 area. But that had a nice buy up there towards the close on Friday. So this does look slightly bullish moving forward. As long as you can stay above like 24, I think you could continue higher into that final gap fill. So keep an eye on that. Zoom, I still like. You're putting in multiple buy signals here. This is kind of like a retest of this falling wedge. It hasn't actually retested the wedge, which is the only thing that worries me. You could actually sell off pretty heavily down to retest this wedge, kind of retest this little accumulation right here, and that would be very bullish. And you could buy that up into like 400, 425, 445. It's just a really hard call here because this looks like you could buy it here for the same exact trade, but I could very easily see this selling off and actually retesting that wedge. So very hard trade here. The best confirmation would be some value gained above this 395, and then you would target 425, 445 as your obvious targets. But just keep a close eye on this one. It's very hard to tell which direction it's going to go. Roku, I like Roku because you are pulling back to retest this gap. If you can fill this gap and stay above 378, I think you could go higher here on Roku, probably to like 425 or 450 because the buyers have been so strong. Now, I don't like that you're losing the OTS trail. I don't like that you're turning black on the OTS. That means that the sellers are getting pretty strong. So you very well could come back down to retest like 363. So be on the lookout for that. But this little area right here, this little pocket, 363 to like 375, this is strong support. So if you start to pull back and bounce out of that area, this is very bullish. Be on the lookout for that. Because if you bounce out of this area, you very likely will see a strong bounce back into like 420. Crowd, I really like this bottom here on Crowd. You put in that little morning star. You confirmed it on Thursday, confirmed it again on Friday. You're reclaiming the OTS trail. If you can turn white again on the OTS, somewhere around like 220, you very easily could push into like 240. So be on the lookout for that. Very tight stop loss would obviously be the trail. Put your stop loss kind of below Friday. DDOG, I really like DDOG here. You had that kind of higher low structure being confirmed. The only thing I don't like about DDOG is you came so close to retesting this trend and you did not do it. So this could be a little fake out around the resistance, around the pivot. And then you just go down and you actually retest the trend. So it's a little sketchy there. But if you do reclaim the pivot around 107, you should be able to push higher into around that 118 to kind of 115 area, this little previous high up here. I do like that higher low structure. So as long as you maintain that, you should be pushing higher. And then even more long term, If you can continue that higher low structure into that high, you should very easily be able to push into like 130 to 150. Moving on to FedEx. FedEx is seeing a nasty sell-off here, but I do like where it's headed. You are headed down into a very strong support, kind of around this 210 down to like 200 area. So if this continues lower with like this kind of momentum, especially into earnings, I think any dip down to like 200, 210 is very easily buyable into earnings. I feel like they're going to have a good earnings. They do pay dividends before the earnings, so watch out for that. That might also lead them a little lower. But just keep an eye on this support coming up around that 200 range. Walmart, very similar strategy I'm keeping an eye on here. You're pulling back to retest a lot of support right into earnings. So if you can get a really good entry, probably around like 135 or even like 132 before the earnings, I think that would be a decent play just because you have so much support below you that even if you have a bad earnings, it shouldn't go much lower. But we'll keep an eye on that in earnings. That would have to be a nasty sell-off down to that support, but that is the area that I'm keeping an eye on. Right now, you actually do have a support coming up, right basically where you bottomed on Friday. So if you do start to bounce around this 140, this could also be a good dip in earnings. So keep an eye on that. Moving on to Snapchat, I really like how Snapchat reclaimed this trend line. I like how you reclaimed the $50 support here. You put in the buy signal on the daily. If you can continue this kind of higher low structure into 55, and then you break that 57, I think you're very easily getting 60. You could even go as far as 65 just because of this distribution was so long lived that when you do impulse out of this, you should see a very strong buy pressure. Now, obviously, you have earnings coming up, which is going to dictate if we do break out here. If that is a good earnings, you should see a very strong follow through into 65. Okay, so the $60 contracts all the way up to the $65 contracts for the farther dated options have a lot of open interest. So people are betting on them having good earnings. Okay, so keep that in mind. Moving on to Dash, I took a trade on Dash on Friday because I really liked how it was reclaiming this little range low, this distribution that I was putting in. It's kind of the same IPO price support that we were seeing before. So I like that it kind of failed downward and reclaimed that area. So we have a very tight stop loss on this around $10. And I'm looking for a breakout into these upper pivots, kind of around 210. So keep an eye on that. I really like the reclaim there. I'm still in some Wolf shares, very small position. I could add on to this, but we could be stopped out as well. My stop loss is below the all-time low, so we're putting in a very nice accumulation. This is almost identical to DoorDash and Airbnb. They IPO'd, they sold off, they accumulated, and then they ripped higher. Now, obviously, very different businesses, but the price action is very similar. I like the accumulation. As long as you can maintain the accumulation low, I think this can continue higher. Now, if it breaks the accumulation low, I'm going to stop out of the trade. Moving on to XLP, it's dipping a little lower than I would have liked, but we do have a wide stop loss on this trade. I think you could come down and fill these gaps. Now, hopefully you don't fill that second gap because that would be getting very close to my stop loss. But if we do come down and fill this gap, as long as we reclaim around 65, this is looking very bullish. We have a lot of earnings coming up on these consumer discretionary companies moving forward. So keep an eye on the earnings for a lot of those big names like Costco, Walmart, Procter & Gamble, I think is having earnings pretty soon as well. So keep an eye on that. CVS, I'm still holding as my leap position. It's getting a little ugly here, but I do like that you are pulling back to retest support into earnings. So as long as you can hold your support around $70, 70 and a quarter into earnings, if you could have good earnings or even like neutral earnings, I think this will push higher into 75. So keep an eye on that. Earnings will definitely dictate if this completely loses this impulse here or if we start to break out of that $77 range. So keep an eye on that. All right, last but not least, big tech. So Microsoft finally broke out of that 226 area. You hit our targets at 236, 238, and now we are pulling back to retest that breakout point. If we can hold above 227, 229, that initial breakout, you could continue higher into that 245 area. So keep an eye on that. You really have to hold on to 227. Moving on to Apple, nasty sell-off here. You hit a couple of our targets and then you failed downward on the earnings. You actually had good earnings, I think. I think it was them or Tesla that had good earnings and they still sold off. But you did have a gap fill here. So if you can hold on to this gap fill around 132 and this becomes the bottom, this is a very strong support that could push you into like 138. And then you could look for a gap fill around 142 to 143. But for right now, you're kind of reacting to earnings. I would probably wait for a little bit more price action to come in, see if it wants to distribute up here or if it just wants to put in kind of a V bottom. Moving on to Facebook, we have this one charted out over here. You did fail our 285 target pretty much to the tick. You failed the 277 support. You failed the 265 support. You have another support right around this gap fill around 251, which you look like you are going to fill. The earnings were not pleasant, so you most likely will come down, fill that gap. It doesn't look like it wants to stop there, though. So if you don't stop on that gap fill, I'd be very careful. You could go for this this very far out gap fill around 234. Very nasty sell-off. You would have to see some strong buyers step in around 251 to recover this. Moving on to Netflix, as I told you guys, Netflix loves to fill its earnings. It loves to fill its gaps. So you had an earnings gap here that you kind of distributed on, and then you broke that distribution down to that gap fill. Now we have not fully filled the gap. The gap has to, the price has to go down to like 501 to fully fill that gap. And because almost every single gap on Netflix chart is filled, I would probably bet that it will go down to 501 to completely fill that gap. So I would not be very bullish until that gap has been filled on Netflix. Now, if you do fill that gap, you did have very good earnings, so you should fill that gap and then continue higher. Just keep an eye on that level. Moving on to Amazon, it's basically doing exactly what we predicted a few months ago. You're just going to completely continue to rotate all the way into earnings, and then earnings will finally dictate if you break out higher or lower. These are both the targets that we are looking for to the upside or downside, depending on what their earnings reveal. If they have good earnings, look for 34.42 and 35.22. If they have bad earnings, look for 30.50 and 29.60. I probably would not pick a direction on Amazon until earnings. Last but not least, Tesla. I do not like that it is failing below 800. 800 is a strong level that it needs to hold. You are putting in a slight bull div, so if you do start to see buyers step in immediately on Monday or Tuesday, you could reclaim the 800 to 830 support. If you do reclaim that support, look for the gap fill around 860, final target being around 900. But for now, as long as you stay below 800, very likely going to go down to 760 and 750. Okay, so keep an eye on that 820 to 800 range. That is your invalidation. But all right, guys, that is it for the summary markets. I appreciate you guys watching. I will be seeing you guys tomorrow for our live trading session at 9:30 in the morning. See you guys.